Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast, brought to you in association with First Bus. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Seaman. We've just made the long trip back from the northwest after Norwich City's Friday night defeat to Burnley. Firstly, I guess we have to start with an apology. We didn't do a podcast last week, like Norwich, a little bit inconsistent at the moment. Largely just because of the turnaround of games. We had a trip to Plymouth, which was very long. Then we had Sunderland. We got a little bit caught in the game cycle. But the beauty of a Friday night game means we get to record one on Saturday. We're recording this before all of the results. Not that they're particularly relevant to Norwich now, but it's useful to provide that context. Paddy, it's been probably a really difficult week since we recorded, with the exception of Sunderland. 1 point from 3 games. Obviously that Plymouth trip as well, culminating in that 2-1 defeat against Burnley. We can probably pick out themes though, particularly of the last 3 away games, all of which after half an hour Norwich City have found themselves 2-0 down. Different circumstances, maybe different context. But yeah, let's start with the week as a whole. Not been a particularly great one.
Not in points terms, no. And I mean that we can condense it down to an examination of this week in 3 games. But for me, you zoom out, that's the season. It's been some good elements, some not so good, and some really poor elements. And across this week, as across the season as a whole, and stating the obvious, that's where they are, which is languishing in the middle of the table. They're not in any danger over their shoulder in terms of the bottom 3, and they're certainly now nowhere near getting in the conversation for the top 6, let alone anything above that. So just a lot of what we already knew has been confirmed and reaffirmed in this past week. You know, even just the last 2 games, the Sunderland and the Burnley, perming those two teams who are going to be in and around that, potentially in Burnley's case automatic, but certainly in the top 6 shake up for promotion. And 1 point from those 2 games probably could have, if they'd have had their shooting boots on, took 3 against Sunderland. But and we'll dig into the minutiae of it. But you're not going to go to Burnley with that setup and that approach in the first half, and against a team who have some of their stats defensively ridiculous in terms of league, historically ridiculous, and expect to get anything. So again, that shines a light on maybe the coach and the coaching team and where their thought processes were, and we'll get, again, as I say, I don't want to dive straight in, but we'll get into the reasoning from their side why that lineup and approach looked like it did. But on a broader level, it's just it's more of the same. It's shoots of positivity depending on where you are. If you're an Orange fan on that spectrum, whether you're willing to feel that's enough to sate you as we move into a big summer and then next season, or if you're maybe more towards the pessimistic end of the spectrum, or certainly the negative, what you're seeing in terms of in the here and now, then more evidence of they're way short, and individually, collectively. So, for me, it's not about really pulling out a 1 point from 9. It's just really pulling out and accentuating a lot of what we've seen this season and what it's turned into, which is transitional, good and bad, and plenty of stuff in between. So, I think saw somebody on X post earlier today, actually on the drive back, have these 3 games told us anything we didn't already know about Johannes Thorup and this Norwich group and where they stand in the Championship at the present? For me, no. It's just reaffirmed what we probably already knew.
Yes, and I think in terms of learning anything new or expecting anything new after, 43 games in now, 42 games in, you're not going to learn too much new around Norwich City and the team and the way they want to play at this stage, but they're probably not going to really show us anything new either. And Sam, as Paddy said there's been good bits. We can probably highlight the second half at Plymouth, albeit in maybe not great circumstances and against the Plymouth team wanting to sit in. You can highlight the first half against Sunderland as being really positive. You can highlight the second half against Burnley. You could also highlight the first half against Plymouth, the second half against Sunderland, where their levels weren't quite as high, maybe not quite as bad as that first half at Plymouth, and the first half against Burnley. So it has been really a week of light and shade, really, if you look beyond the results and behind the results.
Yeah, I think it's one of those where you have to also take the context into consideration in terms of those performances. I actually thought the Sunderland game was the best they've played for some time, really. And although I can see the positives from last night, and obviously the second half was much better than the first, I think it's much easier to do that against a team who are 2-0 up, who, to be honest, at that point were cruising. I think Burnley knew for most of the game that they were on their way to 3 points. And when you haven't got much to lose, when you've just chucked your striker on at half time, and everyone expects you to lose that game anyway, you're away from home, you don't maybe have so much pressure. I think it's much easier to perform well in that second half against Burnley than it was in a game against Sunderland, where you're in front of your home fans. The atmosphere is a bit tense after that result at Plymouth, and people are really hoping that you can deliver. So yeah, I think you have to take things into context. I think Sunderland for me was probably much more positive than anything else that's happened in the last week. But yeah, as you said, it's sort of sums them up in terms of that inconsistency. It's been so much good and so much bad. I think probably a lot of people would argue more of the latter this season, but um, it's just that inconsistency, and that's what's defined their season really. And again, it feels like we're saying exactly the same things, all over again on the same podcast. Even from before the season started, before we'd ever seen this team play, we were talking about it probably will be average. It probably will be a transition season with a bit of good and a bit of bad, and basically it's panned out as a lot of people thought. But yeah, I think overall you have to see more disappointment than goodness from the last three games, and I think that's the mood that I'm getting from yesterday. I think it's almost gone on a sliding scale of people were extremely unhappy with Plymouth, slightly unhappy with Burnley, and then relatively pleased with Sunderland. But yeah, it just highlights what they are this season, and again, it's just the same things we've been saying all season in terms of that inconsistency. Now it's about whether they can change things in the summer, because I think we all recognise that in the long term, this isn't good enough for a Norwich City side in the Championship. Most people will be willing to forgive it in Torup's first season and when there's so much change going on, but if it continues like this into next season, then there are going to be problems. But without jumping ahead too much, I don't know if we have actually learned too much from the last few games, because yeah, as I keep saying, it's the same.
Yeah, and we've filled 7 minutes, so we've got about another 53 or so to try and find some new creative things to say about it. Paddy, we are going to drill into the Burnley game specifically, because that's obviously the one that is most recent and in people's minds, and I think there's lots of interesting stuff to come out of it. But over the last week, where do you feel Norwich City's squad is at the moment? Because clearly, as Sam has said there, and as everyone can see, and as the Championship table shows, there's nothing to play for at this stage. They're not going to finish in the top six. I think that's still technically mathematically possible, but it's not going to happen. And they're not going to get relegated at this stage. So we're talking about them finishing anywhere from probably between about 14th and about 8th is probably where we're at with this Norwich City team at the moment.
You're optimistic.
Well, I'm saying it in terms of maybe what is the upper end of that. So they'll probably finish between about 12th and 10th, maybe. Maybe slightly below that. But where do you feel the squad is at? Because it feels to me increasingly, from what we've seen over the last week, there are kind of four camps really that we're seeing in this group. There are players that are here and want to be here and feel like they're going to be here next season. There are players that maybe know they're not going to be and maybe know their race is run at Norwich City. There's a group of 3 or 4 players who maybe feel like they're not going to be here, but because they're ahead of where Norwich City are. And then there's probably a fourth group of those that are young, want to be here, know they're going to be here, but maybe aren't quite ready, and it's a little bit too early to affect things. And I think when you throw in everything that you guys have opened this with, and you add that layer on, you can kind of add to the inconsistency that they're showing at the moment. So where do you think the playing group is? Because I know there's been a lot of noise around Thorup and the direction and the coaching staff, but it feels to me maybe the players have got off a little bit lightly in the last few games.
Well, yeah, that's a fair comment. I mean, they have to go out and execute, the instructions and the plans. I mean, the way you break it down there, it does afford individuals excuse culture. They're not ready. There's too many of one camp as opposed to another. And all that is true. It's not excuses, but maybe it's easier to sort of push that narrative as we've got down the stretch. I mean, we need to reiterate, it wasn't all that long ago that they had the top six in their hands, and so by definition, at that point of the season, which was relatively advanced, that group of players were good enough to be on the cusp of, if not in the top six. So if that was the case then, and we're only going back, a month, 6 weeks or so.
It was post Watford, wasn't it? Yeah.
To get from that point to this, same group of players, you have to quite rightly, turn the focus on the players and the coaching staff, because as Johannes is very quick to point out, when there's any sort of dissection of set pieces, whatever, it's not one individual, it's the collective, and therefore we're debating why they've tapered off and gone almost on a regressive trend. That is the collective again. So for me, it's not about apportioning blame to one group or another, but to answer your original question, that doesn't help the fact that you've got disparate groups of players who either will be moving on or will be moved on, or aren't ready, or maybe have gone tipped the other way in certain respects in terms of their usefulness and ability to drive this Thorup Napa project forward. All of that creates uncertainty. Uncertainty isn't good in terms of a cohesive, consistent, what you see on the pitch, the product, and of course wrapped around that is the injuries, and again that plenty of that this past week as well, and unavailability. So it's difficult if you're in Thorup's shoes to try and navigate a path to a point where we end this season on an optimistic and upbeat note going into the summer. I think increasingly it feels now that the optimism will have to be engendered by what they do in the window, and by that I mean the outs and getting that right. And if it's players of a high value, making sure you get top dollar for those players, and crucially then what they do with that income allied to what they've already got in the pot to make this squad, but not just the squad, it's the team ultimately for me. There's no doubt, and we saw it the first 35 minutes against Sunderland midweek, against a team who are and have been top four, genuine, bona fide, that level is where that Sunderland team are, and they were second best to a Norwich 11, which had Sargent, which had Nunes, which had Wright now increasingly emerging, which had Gunn, Kenny McLean in there. And you could pick out other games. We can go further back in the season. Sheffield United, Leeds at home, Middlesbrough, who are now coming with a strong surge. The Carrow Road game against them.
Coventry, 6 points against them.
We'll gloss over that one, but there is no doubt there is an 11 on the park for Norwich that can be put out there from this current pool and be as good as any team in the division. The reality is he hasn't been able to put that 11 out on the park all the time. And below that, and we've seen it most graphically for me, that period when they went Bristol City home defeat, Sheffield Wednesday away defeat, below that 11, the gulf is too wide for Norwich to be realistically talked about, this Norwich group, realistically talked about in those top six terms. And that's the challenge now moving into the summer. Yes, it's where they can, is retaining a strong 11 on the park, but the squad needs to be much more competitive and much less graphic drop-off in quality and collective performance, because it's only with a reasonably long depth to your squad that you're going to be able to sustain next season a top six push. So a bit long-winded, but ultimately have the players got off lightly? Possibly, but collectively as a group, which is coaching staff and players, I think they have dropped the ball from a position not all that long ago, and that may to put it in the context of what the season was packaged as from those inside the club at the start, before a ball was kicked at Oxford, that might have been ahead of the curve. But no matter, that would have just underlined that a lot of the work that they'd done was very good and potentially ahead of the timeline that they were working to. But if that was the case, why couldn't they build on that? It's almost as if they regressed again and again. Thorup would, if he was sat here, would throw in the mitigation of players unavailable, and that's fair comment. But I still think, allowing for that, there has to be questions asked about how it's kind of gone in a bit of a reverse gear in these last 6 or 7 weeks, and it's because of that you're now starting to see not just a lone voice being critical in the fan base, but a growing number who are questioning Thorup, who are questioning the players, who are questioning the formations, the approach, and ultimately questioning, how long it's going to take to get from this to what Thorup himself reiterated there last week. In the next 2 or 3 seasons, a team who could potentially, or a squad who could potentially win the championship. That seems an awfully long way away from where we're at now.
Yeah, I think the top 6 feels an awfully long way away now, let alone winning the thing. And Pad's right, Sam. You think back to the aftermath of that Watford game, we would have done a podcast. I'm sure that's available and would probably be quite interesting to watch. I can't even remember where we went with it, but I can't remember exactly how much the points were. But they had a real opportunity with a really. It's difficult in this league to describe any run as favourable as we know, but they had home games: Derby, Oxford, Sheffield Wednesday, Preston as well. It felt like they had a real opportunity, and if you take what's happened since that point to now, you can probably understand why the fans are aware, or a section of the fan base are where they are on it.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a question of why they haven't been able to deliver on the big occasion, because as you said, they have taken it to a position going into February where they did look good enough to go and make those playoff places. I think we've seen that when they've got their best 11 players out, they probably are just about 5th or 6th best team in the league. But ultimately, that's always going to be a hypothetical for me, because even if you have literally 0 injuries, even when it comes to load management and the amount of minutes that players can handle, I don't think 11 players can ever take you to anything in the Championship. So I think it's, for me, you look at where they are currently, I don't think they were ever, I suppose it's easy to say in hindsight, but they probably weren't ever good enough to actually make that top 6, even if they had most of their key players available and things like that. But I think in quite a weak Championship, with the position they were in, with the fixtures that they had, they were in a good position to go and kick on and at least make a bit of a fight of it. So for me, what Thorup needs to be breaking down is why things have gone awry at such an important moment in the season. It's not like, in fact, it was almost the reverse last season, where Norwich were terrible. Sort of, I don't know, Josh Sargent has been a big part in both of those teams, but they were terrible in the non-deciding part of the season, around sort of autumn and late in 2023. And then when it came to those big games, they were beating the teams around them. Towards the end of the season, they really hit form, hit their stride going into the playoffs. And obviously we all know how that ended. But we've seen the reverse here, and maybe that is explained by the lack of experience in those players, because obviously what that team last season was based on was, I don't want to say age, but a lot of those players had a lot of appearances at Championship level. It probably didn't phase them. They'd played in the Premier League. They played against the best teams in the world, so it might not have phased them. Playing teams in 7th or 8th in the Championship, knowing that they had to win to try and push their claims in the playoff race. Whereas you've got players now, especially those who arrived in the summer, who probably going into those Derby games and those Oxford games, they were the most important games of their career, and they were the biggest expectation they'd ever had on themselves. And I think Paddy's right to highlight that in a way you're excusing them when you say that, and I don't necessarily want to do that. I don't think it's about saying these are young players, so you can't expect anything from them. I think it's just an explanation, because I'm sure that's what Torup's looking at. He must be looking at it going, how were they able to beat Watford or Hull, scoring 4 goals in September and October, and they weren't able to deliver in seemingly very similar circumstances against similar types of teams later in the season. So I think that explains part of it as well. Yeah, I mean, and then you maybe have to look at sort of individual decisions, some of the tactics and the way that things have played out. But ultimately, I think the responsibility is collective. I think Torup's got things wrong. I think probably his coaches and people behind the scenes, without knowing everything that happens there, have got things wrong, and the players have got things wrong as well. And of course, that happens in any team. But when there's such a slim margin for error, as I said, I think they were always going to struggle to get into that top 6. Then it can quite quickly unravel, especially when you have these types of players who maybe are more likely to be affected by poor form and to be reliant on confidence. And I think, although that shouldn't excuse the players in any way, I think that goes some of the way probably to explaining why it's unravelled exactly at this moment.
And that probably brings us nicely full circle to what we saw last night, Paddy. And I guess the element where I guess Johannes Hoff Thorup does get thrown in is the way that they approached that game. You think about what they did on Tuesday night. We speak about Sunderland, fourth in the league. They've been really strong at home and away, to be fair, but especially away. They're without key players, admittedly. They've had some fitness issues. There was no Joe Bellingham on the night, Wilson Isidore, Patrick Roberts, Enzo Lefebvre were all on the bench. So there is context to wrap around this. But Norwich City, for particularly the first half, didn't concede a single shot on their goal, let alone a shot on target or anything like that. It wasn't a single shot that they that they conceded, and they had some really good opportunities of their own that they failed to take. But you look in terms of what they did, they penned Sunderland in. It was an aggressive approach. It was a lot more intent around their possession. You go from that on a Tuesday to something very, very different on a Friday, and I think that's where certainly what I've seen, and again, it's only a small sort of reading you can take in terms of social media, but that's where the frustration has been, that pivot, that change in approach when, you know, Johannes Hoff Thorup was appointed. He spoke about going toe-to-toe with pretty much every team in the league. And you look at the approach against Leeds earlier on in the season, Sheffield United earlier in the season, at Carrow Road, admittedly, but they took 2 points against those teams who, and we can see how good they are in respect to the Championship overall. So what did you make of the pivot and the change? Obviously, no Josh Sargent as well, which we'll come on to. But that change of approach felt quite jarring, really.
Yeah, it did. But he touched on this in his supplementaries on Tuesday night at Carrow Road, actually, when he didn't do a formal Burnley presser, but we had a Burnley section, and he was actually asked, because almost what you're describing there, Connor, is why, in the main, have they been very good at Carrow Road and can play Hoff ball in inverted commas, entertaining football, scoring goals, winning games, or getting positive results. In direct contrast, and I don't have the figures to hand, but we all know away from home they've struggled massively.
19 wins in 67 since relegation.
Yeah, but under that, man, what is it this season?
Only 4 wins.
Yeah, exactly, which is nowhere near enough for a club who have aspirations to do what they're trying to do in the years to come. But I think it cuts to the heart of this debate that residually they've so far found it very difficult to replicate Hoff ball away from home. And as I say, he was asked more in the context of why have you not won that many games away from home, and he was just talking about it's the intangible dynamics of, you know, you go away and like teams who come to Carrow Road, they get put under pressure, the home crowd are on top of them, it's a different intensity, it's a different environment, maybe it's more physical away from home because teams will look at Norwich and probably rightly feel that's an area where they will struggle and look to put them under pressure, get in their faces. Norwich have struggled to sort of withstand that type of threat this season. And of course, goals in games change game pictures, and how often have they conceded first, and as they did on Friday night. And that just makes a tough task even tougher for an ostensibly young group of players, sprinkled with 1 or 2 experienced players. So really, I think what we're talking about is the evolution of a group of players, and quite clearly this season, and the stats back it up, they're not able to effectively go away from home week in, week out and impose what they do to teams at Carrow Road. And that will be a challenge for Thorup, not the only one he's got to deal with, but certainly will have to combat, because next season, you know, I don't think it's enough to certainly lean into your Carrow Road form if they want to get to where they want to get to, which is, you know, a side who are really in the mix for top 6. So I think it just boils down to that on a broader level, and then bringing it right back down to Turf Moor on Friday night. The fact that, as he himself, I thought it was noticeable in all his press conference dealings post-match last night, he was proactively getting on the front foot because he will have known, he's not stupid, he's far from it, he would have known that the perception would have been, what on earth have you done there? You've almost... well,
they surrendered, didn't they, really?
I was just going to use that word. I was going to attribute that to you, because that's what you were shouting from the Turf Moor press box, that effectively it was, as he said, sat down with the players on Thursday, said, look, we've got these injuries, we've got more, in his words, central defensive/defensive midfield options, so we need to tailor to the personnel we've got, and effectively wanted a slower tempo, defensively minded, compact, in his words, first half performance, and then you could introduce Sargent, you could introduce Nunez, the game would open up, and if they were still in that game, then they would have a go, in his parlance, to try and win the game. That was the mindset. That was the coaching plan. That was what they tried to execute. They're 2 down inside 24 minutes. Could have been a lot worse. They hit the post as well in that second part of the first half, and the game's got away from them. So that is why, understandably, there's been a lot of criticism in his direction since last night, because it feels almost you've hamstrung yourself before that game really could be swung back in your favour. To go to a Burnley team who would 12 goals all season. They'd conceded 5, I think, is all they'd conceded at Turf Moor. They hadn't still the only team not to have lost a game at Turf Moor. And you've effectively, and we've not even got into the individual errors that contributed to those two. It wasn't Burnley just sliced through them with some fantastic football. It was at heart some poor decision making from Norwich players. So to go into that environment against that team with that defensive record and almost self-inflict to be 2-0 down at half time, that's why, rightly, I think, in my opinion, he has questions to answer. And as I say, and we'll get into it in a bit more detail now, I'm sure, his mitigation was Sargent couldn't play 90. He couldn't go 3 games 90, 90, 90. Nunes couldn't. You've got no Cernak injured. Jurasek, we could devote a separate podcast to him, but he's unavailable. And obviously you've got the Onel Hernandez situation, again, missing out on Friday night. So in that context, we're looking around at the personnel he had. Him and his coaches have got their heads together and thought, this is our best route to getting a result against Burnley. And ultimately, every week, as a head coach, as the lights go out, for anybody watching, that might be prophetic.
They went out a long time.
On us. He will live and die by his decisions. And we can sit here and muse with the benefit of hindsight. That's not a commodity he has to draw on. And there's been 1 or 2 prominent voices on X who quite clearly don't agree, former players who don't agree with that strategy last night. And I can understand why.
Yeah, and look, can I understand the logic in terms of all the reasons you've painted out there, why you would go to a back 5 as it was? It wasn't a back 3. There we go. A back 5 as it was in the back 3. Absolutely. They did it against West Brom. They tried to do a similar thing. And equally, if Norwich would have played a 4-3-3 and tried to go toe-to-toe with Burnley, could they have easily found themselves 2-0 down? Yeah, of course they could, because you look at their defensive record this season and it's been dire, really. So that there is still that possibility. So in many ways, I think he is kind of damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. Because if he'd have gone the other way, and then they find themselves 2-0 down, people would have been going, well, why didn't you do what you did against West Brom a couple of weeks ago? Yeah. That being said, the way it was executed, as Paddy said, you can have the best low block in the world if you make the errors that they made. We're not talking about, as Paddy said, Burnley carving Norwich City open. I've always been very accepting. Look, if you go with a game plan, you get carved open, team scored brilliant goals against you, fair play. You hold your hands up. Not a lot we could do about that. Both goals, Hannibal peeling off Sorensen and getting in between McConville and Fisher for the first one. The second one from Kenny McLean is just for an experienced senior player to make that decision, to take that free kick. I can't get my head around what he was thinking at that moment in time when you're 1-0 down. You just need to almost feel and build your way back into the game. I can understand wanting to play quickly and have the urgency to play forward and to try and break Burnley, but it just was not a smart decision. And so often we've sat here and spoken about them being the architects of their own downfall, really.
Yeah, I mean the mistakes. That's the first thing you have to cut out if you go with a sort of a back 5, such a defensive setup. The very first thing you need to do is make sure you don't do anything silly. And I'm already collapsing into cliches, but I think in this case they kind of are correct, because ultimately they concede one poor goal. It's not even just that second one and the giveaway from the free kick. It's the first one, and it's basically just a simple chip ball over the top. It goes in between 2 defenders, and Hannibal's able to chest it down before finishing. And I think when you go with that sort of setup, it's just so important that you stay concentrated and that you avoid making the mistakes. And they've shown, as you said previously, that they can do that. They did that against West Brom, and maybe this is a slight step up in the level of opposition, but the tactics were similar, the task that they had on their hands was similar, and it's just such a poor way to undo things from there, because ultimately, if that is the system, if you have had that conversation and you want to change things at half time, then you concede in the 14th minute and you've got another half an hour where it's kind of You know, what's the point now? You know, holding out to only be 1-0 behind at half time, and that is, well, that's a pretty miserable position to be in. Obviously, it gets even worse when, 24th minute, Jaden Anthony then scores the second, and they've got to try to hold on to losing 2-0 until half time. And I think the reason why that's such a frustrating predicament for these fans is that they were promised attacking football and a completely different style of play to what they saw last season. I think when a manager takes you to the playoffs, in comparison to a 13th place season, a 13th place finish the season prior, the reason why people want him out must be slightly beyond results. And obviously Norwich will hope to get promoted rather than just losing the semi-finals. But clearly the main difference between what fans wanted and what Wagner was delivering was the style of football, the sort of team that they saw. And that's why I think if I was Thorup going into this game, I would have preferred to, if I was going to fail, I would have preferred to do it in an attacking sense, in the way that had been promised to fans going into it. And maybe that's again, it's an easy way to look at things in hindsight, because he obviously genuinely believed that the tactical setup he went for was more likely to get them a result than if he had gone attacking. So that's why he's made the decision. But ultimately, there wasn't really anything for Norwich to play for going into it. Now it's about showing fans why they should care about next season, why they should keep patience with the players who are going to be here next season, why they should keep patience with Thorup and the project that he's got going. And although obviously all football fans care about results, I think we've seen last season that it's about much more than that to these fans, and they want to see much more than that. So I think going up against a team like Burnley, where you're probably going to lose either way, let's be honest, Norwich had not much momentum going into it. Burnley are a much better side. It was at Turf Moor where they've been excellent this season. I think I probably, if I was Thorup, would rather have failed, playing in an attacking way and trying to be proactive, as they did against Sunderland, and that didn't turn out too badly. And maybe this is, again, it may be me being naive and having the benefit of hindsight, which obviously Thorup didn't have. But I think that's the frustration among Norwich fans. Partly is that ultimately there's not much to play for. So what does a point at Turf Moor really mean? Is there? I know he wants to keep fans on side, but would there have been anyone who saw them get a 0-0 draw and went, wow, I'm bang up for this project next season, 5 at the back, got a 0-0 against Burnley? I'm not sure that really would have excited too many people. So although I can understand why he went that way, I might have gone a different way. Obviously, I'm not a professional head coach, so that might tell you which one is the right decision. But to circle back, I think once you've made that decision, you have to prioritise keeping it tight, at least until half time, when you want to go and expand and open up, and that's the absolute opposite of what they did.
Right, let's hit the pause button there on part one. We'll come back in part two. We'll speak about Josh Sargent, because I think that's an interesting one. We'll speak obviously about the future and maybe the futures of individuals as well. So we'll see you in a second for that. Welcome back to the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast, brought to you in association with First Bus. We are reflecting on the week that's been, really, but most specifically Norwich City's 2-1 defeat to Burnley on Friday night, which has left them exactly where they were, in mid-table, as will be the case for the next 4 games. But that doesn't mean we're short of talking points. And Paddy, it seems like a nice point to, I say nice point, I don't know if it's a nice point, but it's an apt point, I guess, to speak about Josh Sargent. And you mentioned some of those voices, Darren Huckabee in particular, obviously Norwich City legend, has been very vocal on this point around Josh Sargent and the managing of load, which is a terminology that I think maybe doesn't particularly, it's not particularly sexy to fans. It's not what you want to hear if you're a football fan, that your best players are having their load managed, but it is a reality of where Norwich City are, and it was a reality of where they were on Friday night. Josh Sargent left on the bench. He comes on after 45 minutes. There's a change in shape. There's probably an admission that it hadn't gone the way that they had hoped and that they were 2-0 down, so that's pretty obvious. And I think it's no coincidence that when he came on the pitch, coupled with that change in system, Norwich City were better, albeit against a Burnley team who at that stage could sit on a lead, and the game picture and the game state was very much in their favour.
Yeah, true. I mean, that is fair on the Burnley aspect of that, but I'm pretty sure they didn't want to be. I mean, home fans baying for the final whistle, and then Scott Barker talking about how jittery that last sort of post Stacey goal was. So while there may have been we've done enough here, we'll sit on this. I think you also, for me, I'm tipping more towards what Norwich did in that second half rather than Burnley inviting them in. They had to still step forward. You talk about Sargent. I think you can't talk about Sargent and not mention Nunes, because Nunes in alongside Wright transformed what they were trying to do, comparable to the first half when they had nothing coming from central midfield at all on the ball, and then off the ball. They're just that trio, I'm afraid, Sorensen, Slimani, Wright, don't have the dynamism, don't have the collective energy or the athleticism to get up and compete with. I mean, last night, two excellent operators at this level in Cullen and Brownhill, and they had the run of that central midfield. It was a different matter entirely when Nunes came on the park. So, yeah, Hooks has been fairly vocal, and his opinion would carry a fair degree of weight, and it should do, given he knows what he's talking about. And certainly when it comes to attacking players, obviously his era is different to this era, granted, but. But what you would have to say with Thorup's treatment of Sargent, it's been consistent. If you track back a little bit, bearing in mind that he missed 14 games with that groin surgery, and when he came back, there was a very, very almost incremental way that he was integrated back in. Much to the frustration, I'm sure there was a few games the specific games escape me now, but there was games where why isn't he playing, or why is he? There was one game at Carrow Road where he came off where they were losing. Was that Preston? I think it was.
Yes, yeah.
So you're actually losing, and you take off your main man in terms of forward play. But again, the messaging after that game, we have to be careful. This is a fitness management issue with this guy now, not just this season, last season as well. There's clearly issues in terms of injuries that he's had to manage. His body's having to manage him through that period, and what they don't want is him to break down and he's out again for prolonged periods of time, maybe the rest of the season. But bringing it forward from Preston, you look at it, he played 3 or 4 90 minutes. Then Sheffield Wednesday here recently, he didn't start, and he only brought him on for 17 minutes that night. And obviously they lost that game. And then he's played the next 3 or 4 full 90 minutes, and we get to Burnley, and he's taking him out the firing line again. So that is a pattern, whether you like it or not. The head coach and his sports science staff and the people around him who advise him in those areas of managing players' load, injury-prone players, we have to say, based on Sargent's history in the last 2 seasons. Ditto Nunes this season, and the decision collectively, and then Johannes has to make the ultimate decision on that, is you keep pushing those 2 players at the back end of a 3-game week. You're risking them breaking down, and then. But to take Hook's point, the fact is what now, 3 or 4 games left in the season. Are we, maybe if this was September, October, and you've got the majority of the season left, then you could kind of row in behind that type of decision making a lot easier than when we get to the end of the season, and there aren't too many more games to come. There aren't too many more 90-minute worth of load. But I guess in this area we're outside the bubble. We're not inside it. We're not party to the performance figures, the physiological output. They're all, as we see now, whenever they train, they have those monitors on them, and every possible piece of data is ran through the analysts and the specialists. And if the readback is that there is a risk in playing these from the start on Friday night at Burnley, then you don't pay them. So I can see both sides to it. I think, unfortunately, it brings into sharper focus again the situation with Jurasek, because while it is about having to go with Sargent, it's only having to go with Sargent because he's got 3 or 4 other players unavailable, and chief among them is their headline January signing. So it's not a great situation for Johannes to have to navigate his way around. But purely if you look at Sargent and how he's managed him in the last period of time, what we saw last night was consistent with giving him a run of games, full 90 minutes, and then taking him out, and ditto with Nunes as well. So, on that measure, he's probably in his rights to say, well, I didn't do anything different to how I've managed those 2 players in the last 6 weeks. So fair enough. But yeah, I guess it magnifies it when you're 2-0 down away from home against probably the best defensive unit the Championship has seen in many a year, and sat on the bench is your 15-goal striker, and by common consent the best number 9 in the division.
Just to come back on that though, I think if I was a fan, and I think most fans will accept that clearly there is a need to manage him and the 3 game in a week thing, but is there a better way to go about it, that actually you start him in the game, you try and get a fast start, and then if and I recognise if you then take him off at half time, you get questions anyway. But is that a better way to go about it rather than throwing him? Because let's be honest, I don't think the plan was for him to play 45 minutes last night. That was
onwards, he said.
Exactly. Yeah. So he's played more minutes than he would have anyway. So is that a better way to go about it rather than hoping you're sort of 1-0 down after 60 minutes and then introducing him to try and rescue a result instead?
Well, we're getting back into the previous debate about hindsight and no, ultimately it's the head coach who has to make that call before events have played out. Me personally, I played Sargent, I played Núñez, from the start for that reason. Absolutely, because it felt like that was a game where first half especially, you knew what was set up for Burnley and what was at risk for them, and in terms of what they're trying to achieve this season, that it was going to be pretty ferocious and it was going to be in your face. So for me, as soon as the team news dropped, it's not hindsight, is it? It's like, the reaction from most external parties here, fans, media, was incredulity, really, that you don't play Sargent, you don't play Núñez in a game against, well, certainly one of the best two sides, if you look at the league table right here, right now, in the division. So, I'm certainly not here going to defend that position from Thorup. I thought that was the wrong call. But, as I say, we are not inside the bubble. We don't sit down and speak to sports science and medical practitioners and all the plethora of fitness people they have there on the payroll. And if the feedback collectively, because you can be sure, as Thorup himself said after the game, he more than anyone wants Josh Sargent starting every single game because he's that important. He's that important to him and his style of play. He's that important within the division. We can see that his goals and his output tell you that. So this isn't a head coach who's reluctant to play Josh Sargent, but he is obviously being advised. You would assume that there are other factors in play with him, and then on the balance of pulling all that together, he has to make the call because it will rest or fall by his call. So I guess the counter to that scenario that you've painted there is he starts him and he breaks down after 10 minutes, and then he's having to come in and say, well, I was advised maybe, or it was pointed out to me that, maybe a third game in a week is too much, but we had to run the risk. And then where'd you go? The end outcome in terms of the result is probably the same. And then you're without Sargent for the rest of the season. So, there is an alternative viewpoint, clearly, in this, but, it does feel at this stage of the season, why would you maybe it's too cautious an approach, put it that way, to err on the side of benching Núñez, benching Sargent. And it goes back for me to the point we made earlier, that beyond them, even if Cernak is available, even if Hernandez is available, the drop-off is too vast from that calibre of player in this Norwich pool to what comes below them. So that's the reality of it, that yes, this is a debate we're having here about Sargent and Núñez, but it's also a debate about quite a differential in terms of the depth of quality in this squad, and that clearly is the challenge for Napa and Thorup going into the summer.
Yes, and for what it's worth, just because I ask a question doesn't mean it's my opinion. I'm just putting an alternative point of view out there. I think I'm with you. I can see both sides, and I think there's reason and logic to both of them. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, to be completely, not to cop out, but that is the case. I'm very much on the fence. Yeah, I can understand the frustrations. I can also understand the need to be cautious, and I think it could be argued either way. And if you presented me as Paddy has done there with a good argument, I'd probably go, yeah, fair enough. But also on the opposite side. But Sam, I think just where Paddy finished really is where I want to pick it up with you, because there was a lot of talk and noise in January about obviously Norwich City letting somebody go who was on the pitch on Friday night, and Ashley Barnes, who came on late. They did have another striking option that would have helped ease that load somewhat on Josh Sargent. Clearly, Antti Sienats is out with an injury. They happen, and they've happened a lot this season. But that doesn't help in terms of putting more pressure on him. So again, it's not really a hindsight thing to ask the question, but Norwich City now feeling the effects of probably not adding an extra body in that area of the pitch.
They are, but for me, the trade-off doesn't amount to enough to have signed another striker. I think you look at since January, basically. I think, when did Josh Sargent return?
Mid-January.
Right, so it's not like he's had an injury really since that that window closed, and in fact, there's probably been literally 2 or 3 games when another striker would have started. This has been Ante Cianatz's first time out injured this season, and it doesn't sound like a particularly serious one. And Cianatz has also actually grown by having the chance to play more minutes. I also think in another way, if Jurasek had been fit, and obviously that's another discussion completely, but if he had been, because they did bring that body into the building, then he could have played out wide and Cianatz could have gone through the middle. So in a sense, they increased the number of options they hypothetically could have had through the middle by having somebody there who could replace Cianatz out wide as well. So I can understand the argument, and obviously whenever you're in a situation like this where Norwich have to play Borja up front for a half and they don't have many options in that area, there's always going to be an element of discussion. And of course there was that discussion last season as well when Norwich had injuries. I think every time Norwich have had injuries and it's impacted the starting 11, it's impacted the performances, and there was an opportunity to sign someone at another point, this discussion is had. And I obviously completely understand it. Again, it's that point of hindsight, and of course a lot of people are paid very well to try to make the right decisions when it comes to that. But I think the amount of money that it costs to bring a striker in, the opportunity cost to somebody like Cianatz, who, as I said, has grown with the amount of games that he's had over the last few months, I don't think that's worth solving this problem for, I don't know what it is, 150 minutes over the last few months. So yeah, it probably wouldn't have hurt in that sense to have another striker in the building, but I think the negatives still outweigh the positives for me, and ultimately it's taken to a point where Norwich weren't in playoff contention anyway for us to be having this discussion, which I think tells you that probably it wasn't the deciding factor as to their season and as to whether they've achieved their goals. So yeah, I think it's a fair question to ask, but for me, in terms of that trade-off, the benefits they've had from not signing someone far outweigh the insurance policy that they would have used yesterday at Turf Moor, and ultimately whichever player they got in to play second fiddle to the best striker in the league, I'm not sure they would have done enough to have got a point or to have beaten the team that went top of the championship on the night. Ultimately, it would have been a very firmly second choice striker, and I'm not sure many of those changed too many games. So yeah, not really for me, to be honest.
If only they had Sidney Van Hooydonk still.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
And again, a point that we raised in January, how much would that person actually play? And they would have played very little, given what Josh Sargent has done in the recent weeks. But it is a point of discussion, so it's worth mentioning. Paddy, Jacob Wright, he's the major winner out of this week, isn't he? I know we're going to do just the ticket segment later. I'm basically going to take him off the table, so sorry, I'm going to make life a little bit harder because I think it's right to highlight what he's done this week. Obviously, second half against Plymouth, it came on, transformed the way Norwich City played. Again, we could add in the context of Plymouth being in a low block and that game being the way it was, but it still came on and had a really good impact. I thought he was excellent against Sunderland, not just in terms of his ball playing, but actually it's his physicality I liked, and sort of his upper body strength. He was holding players off. He was a lot more aggressive in terms of some of those duels that you want to see in that position. And that is probably the element where I was looking at him and going, you're a very pretty footballer, you're a very nice footballer. Can you now add kind of that edge to your game, that sort of defensive nous? And he certainly did that night. And actually yesterday as well, I thought second half, as you highlighted, he was very good again. 19 years of age, 6 senior games. Clearly Norwich City have an option on him. We've spoken about that before. It's hard not to be very impressed by what he's doing at the moment.
You're hyping him up there, Connor. That's what we do in the media. We build up these young talents and then we knock them down. But
You're about to knock him down?
not at all. No, I'm going to add to the hype. So, well, to be fair, Thorup singled out one player in his post-match when I spoke to him. I think it was the same with the Norfolk lads, and that player was Jacob Wright.
Didn't really work for audio because he was stood behind him and he sort of went that man there, so it didn't really work for radio.
Yeah, I listened to that earlier today. Is that I didn't work out that was the but in the second half, the caveat, because in the first half, and this is the point really about all the things you said there, Connor, are true, but he needs to be, particularly with his relative inexperience and his youth, in the right mix around him. I don't think Slimani and Sorensen afforded him the opportunity to do what he did when he had Nunes alongside him, and I'm sure that will give Thorup some food for thought moving forward, particularly with Nunes and the inevitable speculation around his future as he enters the final 12 months of his contract. But if he's got a Nunes type in there, I think somebody to take a little bit of the load off in terms of ball distribution. There's no doubt in a very small sample, but in a very abbreviated period from, you contrast like the Hull game. I think it was his first start, or it might have been the second one actually, because was it the Preston game when McLean was ruled out to go from that version of Jacob Wright to the one we're seeing now, which is almost his personality is coming through. I mean, you could see the technical elements even in his first couple of appearances, but it was that getting your foot to the pitch of the ball almost in cricketing parlance in terms of the intensity and the physicality that's required and the speed that you play. I mean, there was a lovely moment at Plymouth, just a microcosm of what he's about, where he's just took the ball, but he's on the turn as he takes the ball. It's just the gliding away element while in control of the ball from defenders in close quarters, and it's just class. There's clearly a player who's been properly schooled, obviously coming through at Man City. Why wouldn't he have been? I mean, what sort of role models has he had? David Silva's of this world, and Bernardo Silva and Kevin De Bruyne. I mean, if you can't learn from those guys, seen them at close quarters. But yeah, there's definitely a player you can get very excited about, and we know you spoke to him after Plymouth. He wants to be here next season. Johannes wants him to be here. He's reiterated that again in the aftermath of those Plymouth comments. We know the structure of the deal that's in place. Norwich can do a deal there that works for all parties. So yeah, in a podcast and in a season more broadly where we've maybe tipped towards the negative and what isn't working and how far away they are from that end point, there is, if you're a Norwich fan, something to really get excited about, to have him growing into that role next season with the right players around him in the central midfield area. And he's so important, as Thorup said, post-Plymouth, because he almost just by his presence and how he plays, he injects a different tempo and a different rhythm to how Norwich want to move the ball, and that's so important in terms of not the version of Hoff ball we saw against West Brom or Burnley necessarily, but what we've seen over the entirety of this season, which is, real, quick, incisive, composed, controlled possession. You need players like Jacob Wright. So yeah, that is very, very rapidly emerging as the one big plus point as we go into what feels a bit of a disappointing end to the season.
Yes, indeed, and I think there's two good signs of a midfield player when they seemingly always seem to have space and always seemingly have options, and he has both when he's on the ball. And like you say, you don't want to big him up too much. He's 19. His performance is going to fluctuate. I think we've seen that a little bit. But again, to put in context what he's done over the last week, we're not talking about. Yes, Plymouth, and we can maybe wrap that around the context of where they are in the league, still beat Norwich City and have beaten Sheffield United today. So two very good home results for them, and clearly a very difficult place to go for teams. But he's done it against Sunderland, fourth in the league. He's done it for a half against Burnley. They were top of the league. They're now second, I think, after Leeds won today. So we're talking about teams towards the top end of the Championship. He's done it away at Turf Moor. Yes, with the context of Burnley and how maybe they were set up in that game, but even to do it in those circumstances for a young man, very limited senior experience, as I like to go out again, it's very impressive. For me, Sam, as we look ahead to next season, what I'd like to see more of him, because I think he's got the quality to do it. Yeah. I just want to see him sort of play between lines a little bit more. I think there's been times where he's had an opportunity to do it, and maybe he's and again, you can understand it because he's still a young man. He's still feeling his way into senior football, but I think he's got the quality to be a bit more risky in terms of some of the passes he plays, and sometimes he's opted for something a little bit more simple, which is good in terms of keeping the tempo. But there was one against Sunderland, actually, now I think about it, where he tried to fizzle ball through to Sainz that was so close to being an unbelievable pass. I think there was probably just a little bit too much on it in the end. But that's the element I want to see of him, coupled with probably a bit more of that physicality that we saw in that particular game as well.
Yeah, I thought there was one particularly positive sign in that sense against Burnley quite early on when he chipped a ball sort of over to the other side of the pitch to Fisher, and then Fisher laid off to Marcondes, whose shot was deflected behind for a corner. But I do agree that they've been a bit too few and far between, and probably if this style of play does evolve to what Norwich want it to, then a lot of their goals are going to come from passing the ball between the lines, getting it into those midfielders who can find that space, and then getting those perfectly weighted, slightly more risky, as you said, passes beyond the final line and in behind the defence. And yeah, like you said, when somebody's got that sort of technical quality, I think we've seen from some of the players he picks out, like that pass to Fisher, some of the the ways that he brings the other midfielders into play, that he has the vision as well to do it, because you have a lot of good technical players. I think Norwich have a few of these at the moment where they've clearly got the technique, but they haven't got quite the vision or the ideas to do it. I think Wright has shown, especially deeper on the pitch, that he has got that creativity and he has got those ideas, and he might not be a sort of number 10 type, but he can create chances in that sense. So yeah, I agree, and I think it will be a bigger part of his game going forward. Ultimately, I think that's also easier if you're in a team that's dominating a bit more of the game. I think we're seeing a lot of him taking the ball deep in his own half with a couple of players on his back, and actually he's the one, because he's sort of quite press resistant, he's able to take the ball in those tight spaces. He's usually the one who has to absorb that pressure and then offload it to a Marcelino Nunez, or I think Jakob Sorensen played a nice pass yesterday through to Sainz. He's usually the one who attracts the pressure to then give them the space to find those passes, whereas you'd like to think that if Norwich can get a little bit better at playing out from the back, if they can pen teams in a little bit more, then it will be the defenders who are playing those early passes, and then the midfielders like Wright, who maybe have a bit more of that space and are in a better position to play those balls. So I think part of it is the context of the team that he's been in as well, and the fact that they have struggled even as he's shone individually. But I agree with you, there have been times where you're looking at him and you think he's got passes into those sort of number 10 positions. He could find Sargent, and he mainly plays a slightly more conservative ball. He doesn't take the risk, and I suppose that's also part of development as well, and easing yourself into the dressing room. I think Thorup spoke about Seaman earlier in the season, and he actually said part of it is gelling with the squad so you feel confident to call for the ball more and impose yourself on the game. And I think it's probably similar for a 19-year-old midfielder who hasn't been part of this group for long. When he looks up and he thinks, it might be in the back of his mind, I've only played with these players for 6 or 7 games, and subconsciously it might be easier to pass sideways knowing that nobody's going to get on your back for losing the ball rather than taking the risk. So I think as probably next season, it becomes a bigger part of the squad and the dressing room, and he's more recognised as a player who's been at the club for a while, I think it will be easier for him to do that. But yeah, I'd agree that given he's now put together the ball receiving from deep positions, he's improved definitely. I think his technical level's always been good, but he's improved his reliability in possession, I think. And the defensive side has really, really improved. I think you're right to say that that's probably the next thing for him. And given how Thorup wants to play, I think it's going to be important that those sorts of players emerge next season. And yeah, I think he's shown that he's got the quality to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Clearly, no Onel Hernandez we spoke about earlier. I think we've spoken about that situation in other places, so I'm not sure all the guys or myself really have anything to add to that. We expect him to be involved on Good Friday, so we'll see how that unfolds. And I guess, Paddy, the final point before we go on to just the ticket is about Emi Marcondes, who, as we reported on Thursday, trying to get my days right, Norwich City are looking very likely now that they're gonna extend his stay, obviously by activating that option that he has in his contract of a further season, which probably on the basis that of what we've seen this season probably makes the most sense. And I think from what we're anticipating, he is very likely to be probably the only one of the out of contract group that stays next season. Obviously, decisions still being made on that and not yet to be communicated, but that is the way it feels like it's going at this moment in time.
Yeah, I mean, barring any dramatic twist now. You're 4 games from the end of the season. If you wanted Angus Gunn, Hernandez and Jakob Sorensen, you've already reached out to them, and agreement is in place. So it's pretty clear that isn't going to be the scenario. And conversely, Marcondes, and that was his 31st game last night, 31st Championship game. He's had 10 goal contributions, which for a free agent who came in after the window, hadn't had a pre-season because he wasn't attached to a club. I think that's an excellent return. Not overlooking the fact of his age profile, his experience. He's won promotion from this division on 2 occasions, I think. So if not a 1 to 11 option next season. Certainly, going back to the point of sort of overdone now in this podcast, the depth of squad. There's a type of calibre of player in terms of experience and quality, versatility as well. And we saw it again at Burnley. He can play multiple positions. Why wouldn't you want to make that happen? And from his side, he's spoken in the Danish media recently. He's enjoyed the environment he's found himself in under Thorup, a coach he knows well. He thinks he's in the right place, understands what he can bring to a team, and likewise will afford him that trust to go and express himself. So, yeah, you'd have been surprised if they didn't make that one happen. And the fact that it was effectively, it's just triggering what was already in their agreed, original deal. Not the most difficult deal to put together if all parties are on the same page, which it would seem they are. So, yeah, you could almost say that's the first part of business for the summer.
Yep, absolutely right. Let's end with just the ticket. Of course, this is our segment in association with First Bus. Well, unfortunately, we're not talking about a positive week in terms of points, but I think there are still some positive elements to pick out of it. So I'll ask the guys, and I'll chip in as well at the end, who was just the ticket of this week. And we've got a week, so that is at least extended the options available to you. Obviously, we've taken Jacob Wright off the table, given we've already spoken about him. So Sam, who was just the ticket or thing or anything really that was just the ticket for you this week?
I'm going to say Callum Fisher, and you were raving about him previously, so I don't know if I've just nicked your answer, but apologies for that. I think he was. I think he was very good last night. I thought he was pretty good against Sunderland as well. Not only is he pretty assured in possession, which I think we've seen for basically all of this season and probably parts of last season as well, but I thought he actually really drove them forward at times last night, especially in that second half. He took the ball a lot and actually went into that midfield. We know how good he's become at that sort of inverted role, and I think he's showing the signs that the people were so impressed with when he played in central midfield in pre-season, and maybe that won't end up being his long-term position, but I think the fact that he can go into those areas and that he can impose himself on the game really suits Norwich's style of play. And yeah, I thought he was pretty good against Burnley. Probably should have had his first goal for the club, I think, when McLean picked him out at the back post for a header that he just nodded into the ground and James Trafford ended up catching. But I think most of the other parts of his game were pretty good in both of those two games. And I've seen a few shouts from people after the Player of the Season voting for that he maybe should be winning it. I think he'd definitely be in and around it for me, if not that number one. So yeah, I think that tells you how far he's come, bearing in mind he was quite a comfortable second choice at right back going into the season. And I thought he summed that up with a couple of decent performances in the last two games.
Good stuff. We will obviously Player of the Season vote is now open. If you didn't know that, you can obviously go and do that on the club channels. We will be casting our vote on, not literally, but on this show in a couple of weeks' time on that particular front. But I think he's definitely in the conversation. Paddy, you were going to say Callum Fisher. Have you got anyone else or anything else to put on the table?
Yeah, I'm going to throw young McConville in on the basis that let's hope that's a breakthrough moment, not necessarily the 45 minutes of Burnley, which would have been quite a bruising introduction to what was his first senior start for Norwich. But just it's almost the culmination of that first phase that he's had. Some reasonably impressive cameos coming off the bench. I think he came on at Plymouth, didn't he? I think he definitely came on against Sunderland. So you can see the trust element is building there with Johannes. Gives him his first start on Friday night. Not solely down to him, but a lot of the issues we talked about available personnel. But still, up against some very good attacking players. I think we've already discussed, you could probably look at him, Sorensen and Fisher combined for the first goal. Now, they didn't track the run of Hannibal. But just in terms of the bigger picture, we know there was obviously reports around Duffy and what could happen to him in the summer. It feels like there is a bit of a state of flux now around Norwich central defensive stocks. And for me, it was important that as we got to the end of the season, a player like McConville is in the side, hopefully starting a few games, building up a little bit of a reserve of, okay, right, this is the Championship now. Because it's one thing, seeing it from the sidelines. It's one thing having people sit down and talking through it. He's talked about the mentoring element from Duffy that he can lean into. But he needs to be playing. He needs to be playing lots of minutes now if he can between now and the end of the season because You know, even though he's 19, even though he's very raw, you know, he's a fully fledged international for his country. You know, there is clearly a player of some promise there. And to bring it full circle, what we've been told is that is one of the key planks of this strategy, developing either in your academy or like him, bringing them in, like Wright, bringing them in, hopefully maybe Lewis Dobbin as well in the summer, and then developing them and giving them that first team exposure to go on and benefit your team in the short term, and then hopefully transfer value increases. So if that is the case, and we're told that is the case, there's a visible signal last night. McConville starting a game for Norwich, and as Johannes said, it was quite a difficult 45 for him, but hopefully we see him again between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, agreed. Very randomly on Lewis Dobbin, because I thought this, and I wanted to say, I think the last 2 games have maybe exposed that Norwich City have missed him a little bit. I think his pace at Burnley and against Sunderland in that second half would have been quite useful, but that's a separate point. But there we go. I'm going to go with Jose Cordoba on the basis of the last 2 games. I thought he had a difficult afternoon at Plymouth, and maybe a few difficult games before that, but I think Sunderland, I thought he was pretty good, and I thought he was pretty good against Burnley, all told, as well. I think there's been a good response there. I think he's clearly somebody, you look at his attributes and his profile, who clearly has all the capabilities to be a very good left-sided centre-back at this level. It's just about consistency, isn't it? And that is now the next bit that he needs to add. So, yeah, I will go with Jose Cordoba. I think, interestingly, we've all picked defenders there, which is quite interesting given their defensive record. But
They've only scored
there we go.
2 goals in 3 games.
That's true. Yeah, that is true. And if that wasn't good enough, Norwich scored a corner last night, and only the 4th of this season, 2 of which have come against Burnley. And Norwich are, and we'll end the podcast on a random positive stat. Norwich are the only Championship team this season to score against Burnley in both games. So there we go. It's not points, but it's something. And maybe that's all we have to cling on to at this stage of the season. That's a nice place to leave the show. Paddy, Sam, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you all very much for watching and listening as well. We'll be back at some point in and around the Easter period for the next show. Obviously, Portsmouth and Millwall in the space for a few days. Let's see how Norwich City get on. 4 to go. See you soon.